And it's back to me. So
it's back to you, Josh.
Yep.
You're on a roll.
Buena Vista Social Club with their self-titled album, Buena Vista Social Club. In the opening montage, you heard the opening track, Chan Chan, and now you're going to hear Dos Gardenias.
A tu lado vivirán y se hablarán como cuando estás conmigo y hasta creerán que se dirán te quiero.
Okay, Matt, what are the stats?
Gardenias. Buena Vista Social Club by Buena Vista Social Club comes in at number 113 in the 1990s on Best Ever Albums, number 15 in 1997, number 661 of all time. It is Buena Vista Social Club's highest rated album on Best Ever Albums. Did not make Rolling Stone's list, and Buena Vista Social Club ranked number 656 of overall artist rankings on Best Ever Albums.
I think I saw, Matt, that it was on a previous version of the 500, maybe.
It might have been.
Yeah. Anyway.
But I didn't. I did a look through. I didn't see it in the more recent one. So
okay, this album came out September 16th, 1997. It is an ensemble of Cuban musicians. Kind of the band leader is Juan de Marcos Gonzalez, and this album was produced by Ry Cooder, who has been around since season 1 of CTS, and kind of world music producer Nick Gold. The band name is named after the music club in Havana in the 1940s, and there's a whole kind of like background on different social clubs for different types of professions in Havana. So like athletes had their own social club, musicians had theirs, so on and so forth. Genres are bolero, son cubano, guajira, and danzón. Those are all kind of classic Cuban styles or Latin styles of music. A total of 20 musicians appear on this album, many of who were in their prime in the 40s and 50s. And after the success of this album, they became known in Cuba as Los Super Abuelos, which I found hilarious. That means super grandfathers.
The super grandpas, right?
Yeah. Some of the notable artists on this were Ibrahim Ferrer. He's described as a Cuban Nat King Cole. Ruben Gonzalez is the pianist that appears on this album. Orlando Cachiato Lopez, he's the bassist, and he's the only artist who appeared on all the songs on this album. Compe Segundo, who was one of the oldest members. I think he was in his 80s when they recorded on this album, and he played a unique 7-string instrument he invented called an harmonica, with an A and accent to start, not like a harmonica, but harmonica. And Eliadis Ochoa, he's a guitarist as well. So this album came about, kind of interesting backstory. In 1996, American guitarist Ry Cooder had been invited to Havana by the British world music producer Nick Gold of World Circuit Records to record a session in which African musicians from Mali were to collaborate with Cuban musicians. On Cooder's arrival, so there was still a band to travel of Cuba by the United States. I can't remember if that's still in effect. I know it was dropped at one point or not, but so he came via Mexico to avoid fines, although later he got fined $25,000 by the U.S. government for going there. The musicians from Mali had not received their visas, so that the plans for that kind of whole thing fell through, and so then Cooder and Nick Gold changed their plans and decided to record an album of Cuban son music with local musicians. They recorded at Havana's Egram Studios, which was formerly owned by RCA. It was pretty much like unchanged in time, so the equipment and atmosphere was the same as it was in the 50s. And the album was recorded in 6 days. And German director Wim Wenders captured the performance for the documentary of the same name. I wanted to watch that, as I mentioned in the intro, but couldn't get around to it. But it's on my watch list, and it's in the CTS list that people can check out as well. And that won the Academy Award nomination for Best Documentary in 1999, did not win that year. The album became a word-of-mouth hit and sold over 1 million copies, and the success of the album and film sparked a revival in Cuban music and Latin American music in general that kind of carried through into the aughts. All right, so I was familiar by this album name because of the film, even though I'd never seen it. I just always heard about it. So what did you guys think of revisiting Latin American music this time around? Let's start with Matt this time.
Yeah, this is one of those records, like, I've owned this, or at least I've owned a digital copy of this for years. This goes back in the day to, like, I don't know, like the early 2000s, when I'd, like, you have like a roommate and they have a bunch of CDs and you're like, hey, I can burn that and put it on iTunes, so
yes,
like I just
I
like
did that for you.
But yeah, and so like I've got all this stuff, and like, and invariably, like, probably 90% of it I never really listened to. I just like, I have it, right? I was just like hoarding music. I've always had this, but I never really listened to it. Probably just started listening to it here and there, but never really did. So glad that this is here. CTS is here.
CTS.
And then came CTS, which makes me listen to all kinds of stuff. So, and I really like that. This is a nice little palate cleanser. This is like going into a time machine, right? This is not of the 90s. This is definitely an outlier, pretty much of every genre that we're doing. And this is the type of music that's just like, it's hard for me to really critique this, like, in any cogent way, just because it's so different than what pop music, right? This is, it's very similar to listening to jazz, I think, and a lot of this is very jazzy, right? It's that was, and that's the other thing too. I was kind of struggling to I was listening to this with Sherry, who likes this very much. Sherry loves this type of stuff, so it was much easier putting this on like during Sunday breakfast than it was to put on, like,
for sure.
Not that I would put UGK on,
UGK?
but even something like Super Furry Animals, which is like a great album, but it's also like it's not what Sherry wants to listen to on Sunday mornings.
Sure, this is a way more relaxed. Like,
exactly. So this is kind of like going back to like Getz and Gilberto's type stuff, right? So, but we were talking about it, and like, what genre is this? And I'm like, I have no idea. And even looking at the genres here in Wikipedia after you describing them, Josh, I'm like, I still have no idea I know what jazz is, right? Like, but all this other stuff is just very, it is very unknown to me. I did watch this movie. We did watch this movie last night, so I did see that. Okay. It's interesting. It's not bad. I was hoping for a little bit more story and context behind the project. It was a lot of like performances, which was cool, and it kind of ends with them going to the U.S. They performed in New York City, and they also performed. I forgot the other city, that maybe Tennessee or something like that. But for a couple of times, like they've only did like a couple performances in the U.S. And they interview some of the people and stuff, some of the members, whatnot. But it's more, it's kind of anecdotal rather than like. And there's one scene where Ry Cooder's really just talking about like the project, which was kind of towards the end and kind of brief. So there wasn't a ton of context, but it was just kind of cool, like seeing Cuba, right? Seeing Havana, seeing all the towns that they were in, and it's like, the conditions in which they live, and then and they talk about a lot of these artists being forgotten artists, and that this kind of brought them more to limelight. So I would have liked a little bit more story in that, but it's just, as far as the music goes, this is just really easy, pleasant listening, right? I think the musicianship is pretty excellent. Especially, I really paid attention to a lot of the drumming. Like, I thought that kind of drew me in on a lot of songs, like just the percussion and the way that they were playing, a lot of like the kind of with the hands, a lot of like kind of like bongo type instruments. And the guitar work was really good too, really cool acoustic guitar work. And I love the trumpet, right? The trumpet player does a really, it was very talented, and, put like a nice little layer onto this as well. And the vocals were great. And it's one of those things that's like almost, you want to just put something on to relax, give yourself a little bit of a different feel. It's kind of nice listening to this in the winter. You're dreaming of warmer weather, and kind of, because it does have like a feel of that kind of Latin, feel as well. But also European, like it just seems like of a different, it's just a different culture for sure, right? It's very different than our pop music, so kind of just very different than what we're used to listening to. But it all just kind of blend. Again, it kind of, in one way, shape, or form, all kind of blends together for me. But it's in a good way, right? It's an hour-long record. but I don't feel like it overstayed its welcome. I thought it was a nice kind of respite, a nice little deviation from what we've been used to doing. And yeah, this is good stuff, man. I feel like I should listen to this kind of thing more often. So thumbs up for me.
So I'm gonna out myself, guys. I honestly thought Buena Vista Social Club was going to be like an indie rock band that I had never heard of. I truly like. I went in to put it on, and I thought, oh, this is it might as well be like Super Furry Animals, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like a band I'm not as familiar. It could have been any number of.
You didn't remember?
bands.
You didn't remember the movie or anything like that? That like, wow, okay.
Not in the least did
Wow.
I have. It could have been any number of bands we're going to cover in the next 8 years.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I've heard their names, or any number of bands from the late 70s to like the late 80s, right? That were sort of like art rock bands or indie bands, right? And I'm
Yeah.
like, okay, I don't know. So that's what I thought. And then like Chan Chan came on, and I said, oh shit, this is a Latin album.
Left turn.
Well, it wasn't bad. It was just like, okay, that makes sense. Buena Vista Social Club. Okay, it literally is like a Buena Vista Social Club. Okay, so I got into the headspace. Chan Chan is one of like the best songs we've heard in the 90s so far. I'll go so far to say that it was so like it did such a great job of thrusting me from that immediately into like I felt like I was having a strong Cuban coffee in another space, a space I much preferred being in than the hellscape that we currently are living in right now. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And you're right, Matt, it's like of another era, but it was like I just was able to get such a concept of place here. You know what I mean? Like a slower, deliberate like lifestyle. You know what I mean? It did such a, and I hadn't done any research on it, but I started getting I'm like, this, it's funny like how you can piece together stuff. And I was like, this sounds like Cuban. You know what I mean? In terms of like Cuban sounds that I'm aware of. And then you find out about it. I'm like, oh shit, it is Cuban. You know what I mean? So I'm not too far from like where we're at, but it just did such a great job of capturing what I think of as like Cuban culture, right? Like right from the beginning. And I mean, those first 3 songs, Chan Chan and De Camino a la Vereda and El Cuarto de Tula, like they fly by, right? And they're in each way like their own sketch of like a life, you know? And it's Cuba, right, is a tough one, right? Because there's like 3 different Cubas that people are nostalgic for, right? Like, and people virulently have different nostalgia, right? Because for some people it's pre-Fidel Castro, right? Like the Batista era, like the, you know, some the people who didn't love that would say like the Gringo era, right? You know what I mean? Like stuff like that. And then like the post, you know, the Castro era, right, is like a different culture in some ways, right? And then the opening up a little bit more when this is happening in 97, right? It was slow, but you know, the amalgamation, right, is its own thing. So I thought that was really cool because all of that shone through. This was just such a palate cleanser is a good word, Matt, but I like all of the instruments that make up traditional Cuban sounds, and we get lazy and we call music like Latin, right? Like anything that's like vaguely of Central or South America, we just give it the distinction of Latin, and I fell into it immediately in my head, right, too. I'm like, oh, this is a Latin album, right? But there's so many different Latin albums, right? And you know, when we're talking Latin, we could mean everything from like, you know, the Brazilian albums we've covered to like Mexico to Cuba to, you know, even in that neck of the woods, we wouldn't call it Latin, but we've had like Jamaicans, you know, sounds and stuff which aren't Latin, but they're, you know, in what we would call Central America, right? Like percussion, a lot of the percussion heavy brass instruments, right? Sort of a more like emotional form of music, I would say, would be how I'd describe it. A very different type of jazz than what we're getting in the 90s in America, certainly, right? Like, which is, I think, tied more into like adult contemporary, I would say. And I would say also a different type of jazz than like African American jazz in America, which is also awesome, but like different, right? Like this has a different, a more of a focus on percussion, right? And specific horns. And luckily, all of the instrumentation they chose are all of my favorite things in jazz. I love the trumpet. I love the hand drum and percussion in general. I love sort of that meditative way of singing that shares quite a bit in common with like Afro-Caribbean or just African, music, right? You know what I mean? I described it as meditative, but like the repetition that really drives it home, and like a spirituality in the music. And this was just such a pleasant surprise, because from going from, oh, here's another indie rock band, to like, oh, like here's a slice of like a whole culture that's being placed in the 90s. I know last week I talked about it's really hard to like analyze an album that is nostalgic, like in its time, but this is different than that, because this isn't a band like approximating the sound of another era, right? This is like the other era. And this is a lot more like when we did that Muddy Waters album, like Hard Again from the 80s. And it's like, hey, Muddy Waters was great 30 years ago, and like here he is again. Or like when like Roy Orbison cropped up in the late 80s, right? And it's like, it feels like they're, you know what I'm saying? It feels like they're being like rediscovered. And I don't even know if somebody like David Bowie or Bob Dylan or people that kind of just keep resurfacing, over and over again, if they even are like that, because they maintain their cultural presence a little bit. It's sort of that idea of like, this thing has its moment, and then it disappears for like 30 years, and then suddenly it comes back. And the late 90s seems to be filled with a lot of this, right? Because you're getting, you're also getting like the renaissance of like swing music around this time. So it does seem like there's an era of nostalgia like in the air. And also there's a lot of crossover happening from the mid 90s to now of like Spanish speaking music actually starting to come into the mainstream, right? If we go to like fully pop, right, we've got Enrique Iglesias and Ricky Martin and stuff coming on, but we also like the Macarenas, the biggest song of like the 60s. Selena, right, is like, we could see how you could see how she was crossing over, right? And so this kind of fits in that growing context of like, America is changing, right? And like Latin sounds are starting to be, seen as like mainstream sounds, right? And so it even fits in that narrative a little bit. But what a cool discovery this was. Not because I don't know what Cuban music sounds like, and certainly I'm not enough of a scholar to know the nuances between the different types of music that you outlaid, Josh. But what a cool a cool collection, similar to like The Harder They Come for something like reggae that we covered before, or that Artifacts.
Indestructible, the Soweto
Indestructible
album.
Beat of Soweto, right, for like African music, or Artifacts, right, for like garage rock of the 50s
Nuggets.
and early 60s. The Nuggets, the Nuggets, right? Artifacts, wasn't that like the thing in it? But I do like sometimes these compilations that are able to tie together a form of music that I really end up enjoying and give me a survey of it. So I know I went long there, but like really cool album.
Oh, Brother, We're Out There, I was kind of like that too.
Yes.
Like it is like
that was a revival too, an interest of that type of music. You're right.
Quick cleaning of the stack here. They did not perform in Tennessee. The other city they performed in, Amsterdam, not in the U.S. at all. They were in Amsterdam for a couple dates in April, and then they played Carnegie Hall in that summer of 1998.
The Tennessee of Europe.
Yeah.
I agree with you guys. I was surprised. I knew what type of album this was going to be, but I didn't know the sound, or hadn't heard it before. I found this album really transporting. I think that's kind of what you guys are saying as well. I really like the vibe that this album brings. There's a romantic feeling to a lot of these songs that I responded to, and just kind of the slowed down pace, but a pace that is like still at times like danceable too. Like you could easily like slowly like move with somebody to a lot of these songs. And I think it's, you said jazz too, and it is kind of like I won't say it's like a Cuban jazz, but it does have kind of that same feeling of of musicians that are really good at their craft, like being able to all play together harmoniously, expertly, and like create this music that can kind of have this like free flowing, organic feel to it without being like reliant on necessarily like a structure or like, you know, verse chorus verse type of feel, or even like any instruments that we normally hear on the show, like electric guitar or you know, the basic 4-part you know, 3-part rhythm bass, you know, drums, guitar type of setup. There's a lot more going on here. There's a lot of depth to the sound as well. You can but it all kind of works, and it kind of flowed over me. Like this is almost like the best type of ambient music, because you can really you know, you said you listened to it on Sunday morning, Matt. Emily and I listened to it last night doing like jigsaw puzzle, and it's like the perfect music to like do jigsaw puzzle, because I was like slowly moving but like still locked in, and just kind of feeling the vibe of this. I like there's a variety on this album too. It's got 14 tracks, and it really kind of flows or moves between like, you know, faster paced songs or like ballads, romantic ballads, or kind of like almost like a country western like type of ballad, or a lament, or just kind of the similar, what am I trying to say? Almost like I don't know, just like a romantic type of nostalgic type of song. And it's, you know, it goes before the time period is that they're playing to, is like even before like the 60s, right? In the first season of the show. So it's like music that is just feels completely fresh when you hear it at this time, even today when we listen to it this week. It's got a timeless quality, I guess is what I'm trying to say as well. But yeah, this is also like when I always think like would be really good when like a musicologist can like explain what these different genres are and like kind of expand on what makes Cuban music Cuban, or kind of what the historical context of all these different things are. That's what I'd be like really into, like knowing that. But just hearing this music is an excellent starting point, and I was a big fan of this album, so thumbs up.
Yeah, it's hard, like if not being really an expert and or just really knowledgeable about a lot of types of, you know, music from like Central America, South America, whatever, you know, like it's like, oh, it's all, yeah, John, you're right. It's that's all, it's like a Latin sound. It's all kind of the same, but yeah, I'm sure that there are many differences and kind of nuances. It's just if when you don't really listen to this a whole lot or know a whole lot about it, it's just like it's just like any type of genre, right? Like we talk about this sometimes where, you know, you hear something that it's not really something that you are familiar with, and it all kind of blends together. It's like, oh, it's kind of the same sound, but the more familiar you become with it, the more you can pick out the differences and stuff. So it's just about your knowledge base, really.